Even though it was deep night outside, the Hotel Sophie's windows still glowed brightly. On the small table stood incense, a notebook, and a pack of cigarettes, with a note under them listing room number 302. Yusan Shui carefully brushed his hair in front of the mirror, admiring himself, since 40-year-old men were like wine, getting more handsome with every year. Pouring a whole bottle of cologne on himself, the man loudly announced he was leaving the food on the table. Yushen sat on the couch behind the man holding a red book titled Legal Code of Moj. As he left the room, the guy quickly told his son not to stay up too late because tomorrow was exam day. Still buried in his book, the guy grumbled and kept reading, making it clear he didn't care what his dad said. Just before leaving, San Shui mentioned he was going on a date, then wished the guy luck on all his exams. The moment the door closed, the guy slammed his book shut and stopped reading right then. The guy jumped up, grabbed his phone, and started dialing the police right away. After a few short rings, the next party picked up and asked why the call was coming. The guy said a crime would happen at 8 p.m. in room 302 of the Sophia Hotel, then confirmed he was 100% sure about it. At the end, the girl asked how the guy was connected to the criminal, and he said the criminal was his dad. He sat down at a table with a law textbook and a cold broccoli plate, then seriously added he was serving the people. The guy slowly ate the cold food and thought about tomorrow's awakening ceremony. Yu Shen kept getting this weird scroll in his head that made him wonder if anything would change after waking up. Half an hour later, he finished dinner, washed the dishes, and got back to his usual routine. He was back on the same couch, reading through some legal stuff from Mo. His phone suddenly blared a loud ringtone, and the screen lit up with a call notification. Yu Shen picked up his phone, stared at the unknown number, and wondered if it was just a coincidence. He picked up the phone and answered with a bored tone, just saying hello. The phone started blasting a bunch of curses and slang phrases. Then Yusan Shuyu begged the guy to post his bail. To block out the noise, the guy moved the phone away and heard his dad's instructions on how to find the cash. He dug through the bushes and found a money jar with about 2,000 bucks, which should cover the bail. Without thinking twice, he stuffed the bills into his pocket and headed back to the hotel. He called the detention center to report he's refusing to pay the bail. The guy argued that breaking the law should be punished, so jail should rehab the man and turn him into a useful member of society. Yu Shen added that the policy of law-abiding was always a positive force spread by Moje, which is why people should protect these basics. The guy ran fast, holding the girl's hand who was running behind him and shouting they had to escape. Out of nowhere, a bunch of sharp arrows flew at the guy, which he barely saw coming. One of the arrows came so close to him it almost hit his eye. The guy dodged the arrows like lightning, dragging the girl along to keep her safe. A bunch of angry guys with sticks, swords, and other weapons chased their friends non-stop, shouting threats like crazy. Suddenly, a big wall popped up in front of Yu Shen in the sketchbook, with barbed wire strung across the top. They froze and stared at the problem in front of them, realizing they were stuck. A gang of tough guys stops behind them, clearly angry at their friends. The alpha of the pack, a guy with a mohawk and tons of piercings, smirks and says he doesn't buy their story about trying to leave the town of Kui. Without thinking, he points his broken weapon at them and orders his friends to kill the guy. Then two others charge in with knives. Yu Shen and her friend pull out their own knives and glare threateningly at the attackers. A minute later, the savages are flying around them like bird feathers, screaming in pain and begging for mercy. Yu Shen was running around like crazy, slicing through guys left and right, and his friends weren't even fazed. A few minutes later, all the thieves were lying in pools of blood on the cold ground, and the lady told the guy he could go. The young guy checked the card, which instantly started changing color and showed a proceed message. Yu Shen ended up on some weird warehouse, where a giant wall suddenly lit up with a beam of light. A bright sunlight signaling the start of a new day made the guy open his eyes and sit up. He sat on his bed staring blankly out the window without changing his usual expression. His school was one of the biggest and most modern in the city, making it pretty popular among the kids. He walked down the street, listening to his classmates talk about how excited they were that night since today was the day of awakening. Even though there were tons of people around him talking about today's events, Yu Shen still felt alone. In the preparatory class, Lu Zhenfeng, the boys' homeroom teacher, slammed her hands on the desk, reminding the students that the awakening execution would start in an hour. He was shouting out loud to everyone about what was coming and giving instructions meant to motivate the kids to wake up right and unlock their talent. And the students were paying close attention to his words. Liu clenched his fist tight and told everyone to do whatever it takes to make people respect them. Then he quickly pressed his own clenched fist against his forearm and asked the students why they were even trying if they were still going to end up behind in the end. In an instant, everyone in the class clenched their fists and raised them over their heads, shouting out the oath of service to the people. Only Shen was sitting there bored, staring out the window and muttering to himself that the people were the ones they were actually supposed to be serving. Lu Xinfeng didn't exactly like the guy because after barely hearing a word, he shot him a look that wasn't exactly friendly. But seconds later, he checked his watch and told everyone it was time to head to the awakening point. The group of students, with Yu Shen bringing up the rear, rushed out the door, but the teacher kept a close eye on him, wondering how many patterns would wake up in his case. On the school football field, 3 rows of kids were lined up with metal detectors, and then small tables holding magic balls. One kid accidentally touched a magic item and it showed him the number 4, meaning exactly 4 patterns, which made the guy super excited. The inspector nearby, who was taking notes, added that such a pattern was a solid talent, and if the guy had developed a power system, he could have joined the police force. Since CI's resurrection during the human awakening, patterns appeared on the magic sphere indicating a person's talent, and whoever had the highest number, 9, became the greatest among the living. The teacher called Yu Shen over to the metal detector and asked if he had any metal objects, to which he calmly replied that he always carried a couple of blades for self-defense. Lu Sen ordered the guy to hand them over since the awakening equipment was super expensive, and metal could mess up the test results. The guy just nodded and started pulling out knives, blades, and swords he always kept on him. He tossed a bunch of cold weapons onto the table in front of him, including 4-pointed stars and sharp arrowheads, and the teacher asked if that was all. He calmly said it was, but his classmates behind him started whispering, shocked by how much weapon he had. The guy walked through the metal detector, which beeped right away, making Lu Zhenfen ask again if he had everything. Picking up a thoughtful look, the guy sarcastically said it could have been his steel will. The mentor wasn't about to take that kind of attitude, so he immediately yelled at the guy to take all of it. Yu Shen took off his jacket and waved it over the table where a bunch of stars, a couple of knives, and 2 arrow attachments spilled out. The metal detector let the young guy through and he cautiously approached the magic ball, which immediately started glowing as he got close. A bullet shimmered with blue light, and behind Yu Shen a huge red egg began to show intricate patterns forming. After counting the patterns, everyone stood there with their mouths open because the screen above the guy showed the number 9. The exam inspector stared at the guy in disbelief while he just casually pointed at the ball, saying it was broken. The guy stared at the ball in shock and said it wasn't broken. Out of nowhere, the guy swung and smashed the magic ball with his fist, and the ball just shattered, scattering his friends everywhere. He rubbed his burning fist and went back to the inspector, repeating that the bullet still broke, which he couldn't argue with. Lu Sinfeng grabbed his wrist with a strong grip, stopping him from escaping anywhere. He stepped closer and ordered the guy to come with him since it was vandalism. The teacher waved his hand up and blue flames appeared above them, quickly forming a strange bird. In the next moment, a huge blue phoenix appeared overhead, so Yu Shen had no choice but to climb on top of it with his teacher. As he climbed up the bird, the guy looked down in surprise, stunned by what happened even though his face stayed blank. The inspector and students stayed on the school field watching the giant bird as Lu took the guy in some unknown direction. Suddenly, the familiar scroll reappeared before his eyes, reacting to his awakening and deflating right away. Yu Shen and his mentor stood in front of the director's desk, where the director was carefully reading the boy's personal file. A middle-aged man with small glasses and a suspicious bald spot asked the boy if he really came from the criminal city. Lu Xingfeng looked at his student with suspicion and surprise, repeating the name of the strange city out loud. Even the secretary behind the director was surprised by the boy's origin in her heart. The boy was zoned out and didn't answer the director's questions, so his teacher gently took his shoulder and reminded him he was still in the real world. The guy stared at the student and nervously thought about how even though the kid had the egg with 9 patterns, he was from a criminal city. He focused his hands into a lock and asked the guy what he'd do if he woke up 6 or even 9 times. Yu Shen answered confidently without hesitation that he'd serve the people wholeheartedly. That answer surprised the principal a bit because he really did have lofty ambitions, like someone from a criminal city. The man asked the boy what he used to dream about, and the guy replied that yesterday he reported his own father for committing a crime at the hotel. The director figured out the guy's hint and told him to take a break and keep the results of his awakening secret until he figured out what to do about his schoolwork. The guy thanked the director right away, said goodbye, and headed for the door, while the director couldn't get why this guy managed to escape the criminal city. It was deep night outside, and Yu Shen was just about to reach his own house when something made him alert. Bloodstains on the doorknob made him realize someone had broken in. A stranger with red hair and bloodstains all over his body was digging through the closet nonstop. He heard some weird sounds coming from the hallway and got alert. Without hesitating, the guy realized someone had entered the house and grabbed a knife, moving carefully around the corner. But Yu Shen was way faster, so in just a few seconds the stranger's neck was already under a sharp knife. The guy looked at Yu Shen with wide eyes, and the guy just told him not to move because the knife was right at his yorta. Seeing a bunch of blood spots on the floor, Shen grumbled about not liking cleaning, and the guy nervously admitted he just needed some medicine. The guy gets frustrated and presses the knife harder, adding that the healing potion was on the second shelf. He sarcastically asks the stranger why he didn't take the medicine, and the guy just says the medicine wasn't that necessary. The red-haired guy realizes he needs to get out fast or he'll die, but when he notices the knife pressing harder on his neck, He asks if the kid really wants to kill him. USHEN Chinese letter says that killing outside the criminal city was illegal. The stranger sighs in relief and says he's in debt now, then asks if he needs help. Yu Shen told him without changing his blank expression that returning the debt meant he could kill himself. The guy was sweating bullets and figured his master was really out of it because he didn't need his life. The guy explained he was a killer and could just kill someone for free instead of killing himself. But Shen kept staring at him with that icy look and refused to back down, telling him again to kill himself. The kid was drenched in sweat, his mind racing with 100 escape plans or ways to get out. He screamed asking why the guy wanted his death, and the guy coldly replied it was payback for sneaking into the room and the bloodstains on the floor. The guy panicked and shouted that in a crime city there's an annual quota to excuse one person, and since the owner was super young, it was just impossible. Yu Shen pressed the knife against his throat again, and angrily confirmed that he had a really long tongue. The guy didn't see any better option than to agree with the guy, and tell him or else that guy would finally kill him. In that second, with his eyes closed, he'd already said goodbye to the world, and promised himself he'd definitely be a model killer in his next life. He's confused and opens one eye, not getting why he's still alive. He asks why you haven't started yet, but the guy just repeats the no-kill rule outside the city. He yells at Shen to let him go, but the guy refuses. Finally, the red-haired guy notices the boss keeps noting laws and order, so he switches tactics. He gets upset and says holding someone against their will is also a crime, punishable by 3 years in prison. Yu Shen didn't notice and asked the guy how old he was, and he said 17. The guy thought to himself that the guy was still pretty young since he hadn't even woken up yet. After thinking for a bit, he finally decided to pull the knife away from the unlucky guy's neck. The guy tucked the dagger into its sheath and hid it behind his back so it was almost invisible. Yu Shen told the red-haired guy he could go, which surprised him so much he didn't believe his words. He repeated his words, turned around and walked in the opposite direction, waving him off with a hand. The guy decided not to waste time and ran for the exit, happy that the weirdo had finally taken a breath. He sprinted toward the door shouting he was finally free, unable to contain his joy. But suddenly someone grabbed his shoulder with a strong hand, stopping him in his tracks. As soon as the guy stepped out of the house, Yu Shen grabbed his shirt, preventing him from escaping. The guy dragged him back into the room despite the guy's failed attempts to escape. A minute later, he was back on the floor, staring at Yu Shen with a confused look and asking what he was doing. As usual, it was cold, and the young man said that since the guy had left the room, he wasn't restricting his freedom, so it wasn't a legal violation. The guy crossed his arms seriously and stood before the poor guy, who didn't know why his fate had punished him so harshly. Leaving the stranger sitting in a pool of Yu Shen's blood, he went to get medicine for the guy since he was seriously injured. He tossed the kid a bar of soap and a brush, telling the red-haired guy to wipe all the blood off the floor or else he'd be in trouble. The guy walked up to the big stand, opened the top drawer, and started sifting through the jars to find the one he needed. He heard weird noises behind him and turned around, surprised to see what was going on. Yu Shen saw the guy on the floor, still desperately trying to scrub the red stains out of the parquet. The guy walked up to him and handed him a bottle of medicine that was supposed to help the kid. Little guy took the bottle in his hands and hesitated, thanking the owner for the unexpected kindness he didn't see coming. But just as he was about to take the pill, Yu Shen said the medicine was expired, which was a problem. But his mind was on something else, because he really didn't plan to poison the stranger. The guy got mad, gripping the bottle, while Shen was thinking about the energy coming from the emotions he was about to stir up. He looked at the red-haired guy, and suddenly saw the familiar scroll again in front of his eyes. Yu Shen immediately said he was joking and the medicine was still good, so the guy definitely had to take it because he'd die in 32 minutes from blood loss. Within minutes, a half-empty pill bottle was sitting on the floor, with a roll of bandages nearby. The kid was bandaging and treating his own wounds while the owner sat across from him, curious if he was really a killer since the guy didn't look like one. The guy started saying he only missed once, so he needed time to become a good killer. But in an instant, he brushed it off and refused to talk more, while the guy said killers are the ones who fully commit to the job. The guy screamed he wasn't scared of death and wanted to die nobly like a real killer, but Shen asked why he didn't just kill him and walked away calmly. The red-haired guy said he only works for money because he sees killing as his job and doesn't touch innocent people. Yu Shen calmly replied the kid just couldn't pull the trigger. He got up with a hint of disappointment and added he'd already started believing the kid was actually a killer. The guy started explaining he lied about his age for the job because he hadn't awakened. He didn't realize there was such a big difference between the awakened and the unawakened, especially when he only woke up a spoon. Yu Shen walked back to the door and casually told the guy to rest, clean the floor, and throw out the trash before leaving. The stranger sat there stunned, not sure if the guy really meant to let him go. As the guy grabbed the doorknob, he shot back over his shoulder that the kid needed to follow all the orders before leaving or he'd pay the price. The guy stood there shocked, watching him leave, not sure what else to say. He said as he stepped out the door that the unawakened weren't as strong as he thought. About 100 years ago, the powerful forces of these started reborn, appearing in the world. After that, the darkness started ruling again and destroying everything in its path. The dark forces went wild, threatening the whole human civilization and destroying all living things. But thankfully, the first awaken showed up, and sacrificing their own power and lives, created 4 big seals. The unclean spirits, eastern seals, dome seals, and demon seals were the key to stopping evil, with human masters standing guard to keep them safe. Yu Shen was walking down the city street when he overheard 3 guys ahead of him talking, and one of them yelled that the seal on the unclean spirit had broken. The other 2 stared at his phone in disbelief, not getting how it happened, but when he read aloud that a monster had appeared in Xinhua, hurting a bunch of people. The guys saw a picture of a huge angry bull on his phone, its purple eyes glowing and people around it screaming in terror. All 3 grumbled, blaming the Ministry of Exorcism for their failed job and the messed up seal. Yu Shen kept walking, but the strangers behind him still talked about how things were getting restless in the human world again. The guy was walking through empty alleys between old buildings, thinking about the conversation he'd just witnessed. Finally, the guy reached his destination, stepped over the threshold, and walked into a regular convenience store. Sitting behind the counter was a big guy with a huge beard and a scarred left eye that was lazily blinking. But then he opened his eyes and saw Yu Shen standing silently waiting in front of him. A guy slaps a small paper bag on the table and says the goods were his. The guy takes the bag and the man says this was the last time. He leans on the table, steps closer, locks eyes with the guy, and declares these are now his tickets. The guy brushes off the comment, turns around, and walks out without even looking back at the man. Health slams back into his chair. His eyes flash with fury, and a smug, dangerous grin spreads across his face. Yu Shen coldly said he'd be back next time. Then the guy crashed down with a loud crash, and a pool of blood started forming under his head. After getting home and plopping down on the couch, the guy opened the bag and pulled out a small red pebble. He was staring at the little red pebble called the demon crystal, which was the essence created by evil spirits after siphoning human life force. Suddenly, he jumped up and grabbed his own crossbow because he thought a few had appeared. Within 10 minutes, the room was set up with a full defense system made of several crossbows and a bunch of red threads, so whoever entered first would get hurt. The guy grabbed all the red threads in his hands, held up the red stone, and checked his work. He sat down carefully on the floor, got his thoughts together, and got ready for the next move. Yu Shen closed his eyes, and the stones in his hands hung in the air, glowing red like the strange circle that appeared behind him. On the slopes of a big mountain outside the city, there was a high concrete fence with barbed wire protecting the Pledge of Obedience for the impure. As the group of 3 weirdos in long red cloaks walked up the path leading through the mountain base, they were heading towards something big. Out of nowhere, a weird old guy popped up in the air and barked that the road was closed. One of the jerks smiled nicely and said they just needed to walk through. The old man got annoyed, opened his eyes, looked down at the ones who dared to disturb his peace, and snapped again about the closed road. Then the guy, who was being nice before, switched to a grumpy tone and insisted they go through anyway. In a flash, weird magic forces swirled around the old man, the sky darkened, lightning cracked, and he snarled that they were gonna die. Out of nowhere, a huge black vortex appeared, looking like a black hole, slowly pulling. The red lights screamed in panic, their fear obvious in their eyes. Their leader knelt down, apologizing to the old man, jokingly justifying his actions and explaining his loyalty to the people. The old man immediately shouted in anger, not letting the red lights off the hook. Trying to fix things, one of the fools smiled and asked the old man if he had any more questions for them. The guy calms down and orders the weirdos to rename their divine throne, because it's too holy for such dirty creatures to use. The group leader bows to the old man and nervously adds that he'll pass along the council's message. After that, the group of weirdos finally turns around and heads back down the mountain. The old man glares at them with a disappointed look, then goes back to himself. Magic swirls around him again, and his staff rises into the air. The last of the 3 demonic crystals still hung in the air in front of Yu Shen, but his magical senses were interrupted by a phone call. The guy's shock made the final crystal fall to the floor with a clatter, ending the session. He picked up the phone and heard Lu Sinfin's voice on the other end, telling him about a talent assessment at school tomorrow that he needed to attend. He kept explaining how important the assessment was, since only one student would pass, and the guy just nodded along. Out of nowhere, the teacher asked the boy about his dad, and he didn't answer, with his mind flashing back to his dad, making him think for a second. Yu Shen immediately shot back that phone use was probably banned in prison, and hung up the call. Lu Zhenfeng stood there with his mouth open, still holding the phone. It wasn't until several minutes later that he remembered the guy had turned his dad in for a crime committed at the hotel. Yu Shen stood in the middle of the room, staring at the calendar hanging on the wall in front of him. He stared at the number 1 and realized there were only 312 days left. The next day at school, everyone was buzzing about the assessment, worried if it would go well. The teacher stormed into the classroom and everyone fell silent, stopping their chatter. The instructor leaned on the desk and said he just got a message about the situation changing. He explained that this time, not only did the Ministry of Exile send impure ones, but also reserve officers from the Ministry of Security, which meant only 5 students could take the assessment. At the same moment, all the students suddenly thought about being chosen, but Yu Shen acted like it didn't matter to him. The teacher raised his hand and started slowly explaining that the principal had picked the students going on the assessment, preparing to point them out. After a short pause, Lu Zhenfeng loudly announced that Yu Shen had been chosen. Right then, a bunch of angry shouts erupted from the class because the classmates saw the guy as a weakling and were upset the principal had picked him. The teacher scolded the students for their outburst and added that there's no such thing as fairness in the world, and whoever gets hit by it should see it as a sign to work on themselves. The kids slumped their heads down, quietly sitting at their desks listening to the lecture without trying to argue with the teacher. Liu Xinfeng wraps up his speech and tells Yu Shen to head to the principal's office because he wants to talk to him. A few minutes later, Yu Shen stands in the principal's office where the principal is always sitting at his desk, with his secretary standing behind him. The principal smiles and cheers at his energetic presence, then asks how the guy's dad is doing. Yu Shen gives a cold response, saying the criminal city's schemes cost a lot. The principal didn't expect such a short answer and gets thrown off, not knowing what to say next. He cleared his throat and went straight to the point, saying that the evaluation wasn't just about students but the whole school, which was a big deal because Mobi wasn't a big city. The man said the evaluation would decide who becomes the new principal, so he told the guy not to back down, no matter what it cost. The guy stayed calm and coldly asked the principal what the price was. The principal was genuinely surprised by the bold question, since he didn't expect such a provocative challenge. Yu Shen explained that in the criminal city's rules, you have to pay when someone asked you for something, so he refused to offer his service for free. The director said he'd let the guy take the exam as a reward, which was good for both of them. The guy said the exam was basically a ticket someone had to pay for. He called it a fee and added that in this crime-ridden city, those who broke the rules didn't last long. Handing over the position, the director promised the guy 3 level 1 crystals. With the same unreadable expression, the guy agreed, calling it a deal. He turned toward the door and figured out who needed to be killed, which surprised the principal and secretary together. The man insisted he didn't need to kill anyone, which made the guy a little happy since killing was banned outside the criminal city. The principal was stunned by the student's attitude and realized he was missing 3 soul stones. He reminded the guy not to worry about the other students and to rest on the school bus, which the boy just agreed to. Yu Shen picked a nice spot by the window and was sitting peacefully when a guy approached him out of nowhere. He gave Zhao Zicheng a suspicious look while he introduced himself as a 9B student. Behind him stood 2 people, a girl and a guy he introduced as Li Kaya and Yan Jiaosen, then asked for Yu Shen's name. The guy coldly introduced himself and kept staring out the window, ignoring them. Zhao decided to sit with his new friend and started talking about how he found out the mayor was at the assessment. He started talking about how Premier's son was even older than Moji and thought the best talents came from there. The guy smiled and said if the guy had joined Moj, he'd have been popular right away, so it was a unique chance to become successful. CZI suddenly realized that in other schools there were lots of masters, but only one was chosen, making it incredibly hard to win. His friends joined the conversation, saying Zhao's class president had to win for sure since his dad was the head of Mobi's security department. Not hiding his pride in his dad, he just added that he'd have to win anyway. He assured Shen that working with him would be great, while the guy eagerly asked about his dad because that's what caught his attention first. Sai confirmed his words, and Yu Shen said his dad was currently in jail. He smiled and said his dad could have easily gotten out of jail if he hadn't broken anything serious. But Yu Shen stopped him and asked if his new friend could lengthen the sentence. Zhao Ci was stunned and didn't expect such a request, since people usually ask to reduce the sentence. He looked at the guy in surprise and asked again what he meant, but Yu Shen just shrugged it off. CZI stared at the guy in disbelief, not getting how someone could hate their own dad so much that they'd lock him up. The guy slouched in his seat and looked the other way, scowling like he was annoyed. Yu Shen watched the guy curiously, wondering why he wasn't radiating the gray energy he usually tried to summon. The bus taking students to the exam suddenly started heading out of town, closer to the mountainside. The hero didn't pay any attention and just kept staring out the window, checking out the crazy views. Zhao looked out the window and realized they were no longer in Mobi, which surprised him because the exam was being held outside his territory. He asked the driver if they'd taken the wrong turn since a recent incident in Xinhao made it really dangerous to be out in the countryside. The driver smiled and said they hadn't messed up at all, because the exam location had been changed for the time being and they were heading to an old factory outside the city. He assured the student that there was no danger since they had people from Moj with them, and doing the exam out in the country was way easier. After that, Zai relaxed a little and asked the driver to let him know when they got there, while the students got some sleep. Yu Shen was kinda spooked by something but kept his cool and kept staring out the window. After a few hours on the bus, they pulled up, and the students found themselves in front of a big old factory that looked abandoned. They started getting out of the buses, happy they finally made it, but Yu Shen still had that weird feeling. In a flash, the guy spotted his mentor, who had already arrived and was seriously explaining stuff to the kids. Zhao and Li suddenly screamed when Du Xiu, the guy with the six-pattern talent, showed up too. Everyone started turning on the older guy, surprised by his thick, neat beard. Yu Shen didn't care about the gossip, so he just walked away. CZI told the guy to stay clear of Du Xiu because he was seriously powerful. The guy shrugged it off, then Zhao said he really believed the guy could win. A bus driver watched the students checking out the factory building, holding a cigarette between his teeth. He spat the cigarette on the ground and stomped on it right away, making sure it didn't reignite. When the kids didn't do anything interesting, the driver turned around and headed in the opposite direction. He walked into the room where a man sat at a computer-filled table and asked him how things were going. The guy, who was a bit older and surrounded by screens and electronics, said things weren't going too well. Smiling, the driver told his partner about the kids' lack of focus, trust, and naivety, which was basically a dream come true since Moby confirmed his ease of control. The guy suddenly pointed at the screen showing Yu Shen and said this guy was different from the rest. Lu Zhenfen stood in front of the students giving instructions because this time he was leading the team, and they had to wait for people from the exile ministry to report the exam topic. The mentor noted that this exam was a unique chance to show off. He told the students to act on their feet because that was their only shot at success. The teacher looked at Yu Shen wondering if the guy could surprise him this time, while Yu Shen just lazily stared into the distance. Suddenly, a loud engine roar echoed across the clearing as a huge dark green off-road vehicle tore onto the factory grounds. He screeched to a stop right in front of the group of kids, killing the loud music blasting from inside. The Jeep's door creaked open and a big guy's leg popped out. A burly man in uniform stepped out, one cigarette burning between his teeth. The stranger didn't waste time and started walking toward the teacher, scanning the crowd with one eye. He walks up to Lu, puts a hand on his shoulder, and asks with a smile how he ended up in such a place since they hadn't seen each other in years. Lu Zhenfeng smirks and says he started working as a teacher. The stranger's serious face instantly melts into surprise because he totally didn't expect his old friend to become a mentor. But he doesn't stay in that mood long, and within a minute, after pulling a cigarette from his mouth, adds that it was a solid choice since he was way safer. The man turns around and looks at the pile of kids, studying each one with a sharp gaze. He grinned again and asked his friend if his students were okay. The kids were skeptical of the stranger, not knowing who he was or where he came from, while Shen's expression stayed the same. Seeing no one was willing to talk, the stranger started walking toward the students. Yu Shen was the first in his path, not stepping aside even though he noticed the man asked the boy if he wasn't scared. The boy asked him why he should be scared with a note of surprise. The stranger laughed and patted the guy on the shoulder, telling the teacher this kid was interesting. The man finally introduced himself as Luo Tian, revealing he was from the Ministry of Exile for the impure provinces of Jiangbei. He said he wouldn't talk about his other achievements and shifted the conversation to the topic of evaluations. Luo Tian thought things over, lighting a cigarette and running through a bunch of ways to test the kids. He stared at the pile of losers in front of him, totally out of place with Yu Shen, and suddenly got an idea. He laughed and said the guys should win the fight, then the winners would stay for the assessment and everyone else would go home. The students started whispering to each other, surprised by how easy the task seemed. Lu Senfeng just looked at his friend, not surprised by the methods at all since it was his style. Lo Tian announced the start of the competition, and right behind him appeared the image of a huge wolf-like beast. Seconds later, the beast turned into a long green dragon spinning around to form. The guy said whoever gives up or steps out of the ring gets counted as the loser. He pointed at the two guys and ordered them to fight first. Xiao Zhaifeng, one of them, stepped into the ring and started throwing punches to get ready for the fight. A second later, he powered up and launched himself at his opponent with a fist, shouting a victory slogan. Without leaving his spot, the opponent also screamed, getting ready for a brutal fight. The ring was so dusty that the fighters were completely hidden from view for the next few minutes. The teacher watched the chaos, realizing the kids had no combat skills at all since they'd never been trained in martial arts. When the dust finally cleared, the crowd saw Xiao Zhaifen bloodied and humbly asking everyone not to laugh, with his opponent motionless at his feet. Lo Tian laughed at the guy's reaction and told him he'd won. Seconds later, he pointed at Yu Shen and Du Zhu and ordered them to fight next. Du Sui grinned and rolled up his sleeves, mockingly telling Yu Shen that he didn't even have a chance. The mentor watched his guy intently, hoping against hope that he'd pull off something surprising. The guys walked into the ring and stood right in the middle, ready for a brutal fight. Yu Shen raised his hand and asked the crowd if weapons were allowed. Lo Tian smiled and agreed, saying the guy could use anything, and the guy thanked him. The other students laughed at the guy's weird question, but Du Sui immediately threatened to beat him up. Only Zhao Zai genuinely supported his friend, shouting support slogans and believing in his victory. Lo Tian respectfully looked at the day's most interesting opponents, took a cigarette out of his mouth and told them to start. As soon as he got the go-ahead, Yu Shen immediately got into stance, tensed up, and focused all his concentration on the opponent. In the blink of an eye, the guy pushed off and fear flashed across Du Sui's face because he totally didn't expect such a sudden start. The guy flew at his opponent with uncontainable rage, completely ignoring the bat the other guy was holding. The boy ducked past Du Zhu and the guy suddenly felt a sharp, growing pain in his hand. The man froze, not knowing what happened, as blood started to seep from his hand. The bat fell from his hand and thudded onto the ground, while he finally started screaming in pain. The guy grabbed his wrist, where a big cut from the blade Yu Shen usually used in fights was visible. Du's eyes widened as he stared at the dark red blood gushing out of his wound, and the horror just kept building. Yu Shen knelt the poor guy down, pressed his hand to his face, and pulled out a huge knife from behind. With one quick move, he tossed the guy to the ground and was about to stab him with the knife, but it was all accidental. Even though Du Zhu was pinned to the ground with the guy's hand on his face, he still begged the guy not to kill him because it was just a battle. But Yu Shen's serious expression made it clear his intentions were final. Out of nowhere, the guy lunged and drove the knife into the spot just an inch away from his opponent's head, making the guy scream like his head was being cut open. Realizing he was still alive, the man's eyes welled up with tears and he asked in a shaky voice if the guy was joking. Yu Shen loomed over his helpless body while Luo Tian, smiling, started walking toward the guys. The guy clamped both sides of his opponent's face tight, preventing him from closing his mouth. He stuck a few fingers in the guy's mouth, trying to find something, while Su Yu watched nervously. Luo Tian, now completely confused, asked the guy what he was doing because he didn't understand what was going on. The guy yanked out one of Luo Tian's back teeth, making him scream in pain. Yu Shen stared at the empty tooth, surprised it didn't have any poison in it. Luo Tian hesitantly asked the guy if he was looking for poison, and the guy agreed, grabbing Du Zhu's hair and finally lifting him up. The guy searched through Du Zhu's pockets, under his clothes, and everywhere he could have hidden poison, but there was nothing there. The ministry rep got fed up with the situation and finally stepped in, asking if Su Yu even had the poison at all. Yu Shen paused from his work for a second and said that if the guy got captured by enemies without the poison, his suffering would have been worse than death. Poor Du lay there mentally kicking himself for not hiding the poison, since that would have saved him from all this torture. But he rejected those thoughts instantly because he loved his awesome life and didn't want to die at all. Once Luo Tian figured out what was going on, he asked the guy if he was from a criminal city, and the guy agreed and asked if people really didn't hide poison beyond his borders. Luo confirmed his doubts and went back to his old friend, asking if he knew the guy's origin, but the teacher just questioned him about whether it mattered to the guy. Lu Zhenfeng scratched his head and calmly said that according to the rules, terrible crimes weren't considered because they weren't discussed after they happened. The teacher stepped close to his friend and stared him in the eye, adding that this only applied if the student didn't kill again. Finally, he firmly stated that without any day of mistakes, the guy would always remain his student. Tian turned around and headed toward his car, tossing off that his enemies were demons, not people, so Lu Zhen could forget about it since the competition was over today. He told the teacher the testing would continue tomorrow, and the students would have to stay at the factory overnight since it was big and had plenty of space to sleep. As Luo opened the car door, he suddenly offered the teacher a drink since they hadn't seen each other in a while. But the man said his students were still under his care. Realizing the number would be blocked, he just got in the car and for some reason remembered Yu Shen. Luo gave an unexpected look at Lu Zhenfen and said it would be hard to say if the boy would pass the test. A huge pile of big white rats ran across the floor of the old factory, constantly searching for leftover food. The students didn't want to stay at the factory overnight because it was super gross and stank to high heaven. Zhao Zai ran up to the teacher sitting by the wall and asked about something he did. The teacher looked interested in the guy, who then asked why no one from the ministry had checked out their talents. He was really bummed about it because school always said talent was directly linked to how high your pattern level was. Lu Xin thought about it for a sec and said talent alone never got you to the top without some serious backing. He slumped his head down and added, frustrated, that there were no geniuses anywhere. Other students started approaching the teacher and listening to his story about how having a genius in such a huge population was normal. He stood up and said that if talent alone was needed, people would have beaten the darkness long ago. The teacher had met a lot of geniuses in his lifetime, but few actually made it to a good life. Ko didn't like his talk about considering his talent a special gift and looking down on others being too arrogant, since those people usually messed up normal stuff. He looked at Du Sui and explained that the lucky students from famous schools entered the obedience pledge without being dirty and didn't kill anyone because of their own fear, then cut off their own heads. Suddenly, the mentor screamed that this world was missing geniuses, but in Magu everyone was stronger than kids and the price for that was insane. After that, Lu Zhenfeng remembered the 4 big traps, where human life meant nothing and only monsters ruled. Human life there was worth less than a sip of water, and even less than a piece of bread. He put his hand to his chest and said that surviving there was impossible without determination, a cold head and enough attention. The students stood in silence, silently understanding that the path they'd chosen wasn't as easy as it seemed. Lu Zhen sat back in his usual spot and told everyone to rest before tomorrow's test, but Zhao suddenly approached him complaining about the dirt and saying he wasn't tired at all. The teacher's calm expression turned to irritation and scolded the boy for his disgust. He barked at all the students to sit down and said this group was just a bunch of flowers compared to the 4 squads. The mentor jabbed a finger at the calmly sitting Yu Shen, setting him as an example for all the kids. He opened his eyes and stared at everyone in surprise after hearing his name mentioned. As soon as he saw dozens of other students staring at him with the same shock, he got a little flustered. The awkward atmosphere didn't sit well with him, so he finally decided to stand up. Keozai asked where he was going, and he dryly replied he was heading to the bathroom. Watching him walk away, Keozai muttered that even though the guy was kinda moody, it didn't make him a bad person, while the girl standing next to him raised an eyebrow in surprise. He looked at her with a stunned expression and realized it was a total fatality. Yu Shen was carefully hiding behind the corner of one of the old factory pavilions. He peeked around the corner and saw a camera pointed right at him. The guy went back and figured this had to be the last camera on his path. He was searching for a spot without cameras since the whole factory was covered in them, but it finally hit him. The guy immediately grabbed his stuff and carefully moved toward the part of the building he needed. He cautiously made it to the slightly open door and peeked in, seeing another camera that was already the 10th one. Yu Shen desperately kept going, looking for another room that might interest him a little more. Finally, the guy reached another white door, behind which familiar voices were coming from. Without a hint of fear, the kid grabbed the handle and cracked the door open just enough to hear whoever was inside. 2 guys start talking right away, one asking the other if he knows anything about Lu Sinfen. One of the guys wonders if the mentor was one of the guards of the obedience vault, because if so, he was just wasting his talent there. Yu Shen listens closely as the guys discuss moving the teacher to the district center, since his teaching methods are worth paying attention to. The bus driver, sitting on the couch, notices the door to the room is slightly ajar and someone standing behind it. The guy gives a lazy smile, thinking the kid was actually pretty funny. Shen decided to skip the pointless chat and headed back to the factory building where the others were. As he passed by Lu Senfen, the guy suddenly called out and asked if the boy had a plan for the hermit wolf. The boy ignored the question and walked to the familiar wall outside to sit down. The eerie silence of the deep night was shattered by a loud crash and other noises that made everyone on site really alert. The boy shot up and tensely looked into the distance, trying to spot something under the pale moonlight. He grabbed the crossbow nearby without thinking, loaded it up, and got ready to defend himself. The guy looked to his teacher hoping for help, but the teacher gave off a vibe that he didn't care and the kid was on his own. Yu Shen realized the situation and headed for the exit, while the mentor thought the hermit's fates were usually tragic. Lo Tian stood on the mountain with a big dog on a leash, ready to show off his strength. The man laughed, ready to teach those who slept outside how tough it was for the awaken. Tian let go of the massive chain wrapped around the dog's neck, sending it crashing down with a loud clang. The rabid dog took off toward the factory in a flash, clearly signaling disaster. The men saw the huge dog on the cameras, looked like a real demon and just lost it, not getting why Lo wanted the students to kill demons. The supervisors got flustered and started begging the bus driver to wake up. The driver just pushed his cap aside a bit, told them to stay calm and sit down. He yawned and said that one demon wouldn't be a big deal, especially since it was time for the students to show off the skills they learned at school. One of the guys screamed that the captain didn't care about the consequences, since demons were really dangerous. The bus driver, clearly annoyed, pulled back his jacket to show something. A weird symbol was on his shoulder, and he explained it was the key to whether or not things would go badly that night. He lit a cigarette and said a little demon activity would help the kids show off their talents, and the guard eventually gave in. A huge dog was already inside the pavilion where the poor kids were hanging out. The kids screamed and screamed, trying to run away from the dog to save their lives. The kids screamed in fear and called for help, not knowing where the demon came from. The wild dog barked and tore everything apart on its path, leaving nothing intact. Finally, Dushai decided to step in, shouting that he'd try to protect the kids. As soon as the demon saw the stick in his hand, he snarled at the guy like it was a weapon. In the blink of an eye, the demon swung his full power and knocked a chunk of wood out of Du's hand, leaving a huge gash on his arm and sending him flying. Suddenly, Zhao Zhai appeared in front of the wounded Du, trying to calm him down and encourage them to fight together. To save Du Zuya, he hit the dog hard in the face, giving the man a chance to get back up. The fearless guy stood tall in front of the poor guy and glared at the dog, once again saying it's way harder to beat everyone alone, so they needed to work as a team. Lu Xinfeng watched from afar as the terrified students screamed and tried to protect themselves from the monsters, choosing to head home instead of facing them head-on. The teacher glared straight into the camera above him and tried to shame the viewers by asking if they really thought it was good for kids to be exposed to this. On one of the computers, Zhao was seen fighting off the dog alongside Duzu, showing bravery despite the odds. The captain watched them from the sidelines, surprised by their courage even though they were clearly out of their element, since in the deadly chase the strongest part was the head. But right then, Lu Xinfeng's mind turned to Yu Shen, who was really really getting on his nerves since the guy was still missing from the fight. Out of nowhere, the guy walks up to the door, yanks the handle, and tells the guards they didn't need to look for him if they were just office rats. Behind the door, a dark figure of a young guy shows up, smirking at the man and ignoring the captain's question about whether he came just to hang out. The stunned guards are surprised by the kid's sudden appearance, not getting how he found them, and he reminds them about their own tracks. The confused guys don't get how they could track down the observation room with such vague clues. One of them asks the kid why he's not helping his classmates, but the guy confidently says they'll all make it no matter what. The bus driver warned the kids they'd die without his help, but he wasn't about to help them anyway. Yu Shen shrugged and said the hellhound was weak, so his classmates had a shot at winning no matter what. The captain snapped at him, saying he'd boost the hound's strength on purpose, but the guy just kept calm and insisted it wasn't the case. He mentioned the 75th article of Mojai's criminal code, which details intentional murder and a 7-year sentence for committing it. The man started to lose his grip, so he asked the guy if he'd save his friends if the captain decided to help them. The guys behind the boss's back exchanged glances, realizing he was really nervous. The guy stayed calm, shook his head no, saying he wouldn't save them. The driver didn't get why the kid was so selfish, yelled that he was sick because he wanted to watch his classmates die. Yu Shen was smarter, so he said he'd rather report to the police and get a reward than die with them, since he couldn't handle the captain. He told the captain about Moj's school policy, which offered huge payouts for reporting killers during assignments. The guy kept his indifferent face as he said that after killing 10 students, he'd get a 10-point bounty for being an especially dangerous criminal. The boy asked the captain again if he was going to kill the kids, but the man had no good answer, so he just stood there silently. The driver's mind flashed back to the image of him standing on top of a hill with 2 men in the middle of dark, deep night. Waiting for something big, they loudly prayed to the night god, the Great Lord. The captain spread his arms wide and smiled, saying that the starlight washed over them that night and the god was definitely watching out for them. He raised his hands up and said that their plan's success, which would make them servants of God, would be the greatest favor ever given to them. The man switched to a fierce and severe expression, shouting that the students from Mobi were doomed to die that night. Everyone else yelled in unison, repeating their leader's words and raising their hands up to pray to God. They joined hands, closed their eyes, and prayed to God, calling the children's lives a sacrifice for their sin. The captain took a step forward and confidently said they'd start with the plan in half an hour. Mojlin, the department head, sat at his massive desk signing another document with a serious look on his face. His phone on the side suddenly vibrated, and a call screen popped up from an unknown number. The man got a little annoyed and picked up the phone, only to hear someone talking about some kind of deal. Lin got a little curious about what the stranger was saying and pulled away from the papers to let the conversation continue. He put the phone on speaker and placed it on the table, and from there, a man's voice hinted that the city's security would let a convoy of cars pass through in 10 minutes without any problems. The man kept working and asked if the conversation was about heretics, and the other guy agreed, calling them heresy against thousands of gods. Liney rolled his eyes and grumpily told the stranger to announce the price, not taking his eyes off the document in front of him. The voice on the other side started talking about the organized assessment run by the boss, including in Mobi City where it wasn't finished yet, then asked if the 12 students would be a problem. He spoke in a threatening tone, saying that in any agreement there was always a guarantor, and without knowing about him, the boss would have no choice. The stranger on the other side introduced himself as the client, and Liney threatened him with problems if even one student died. He ended by saying that if the agreement is broken, the provinces of Jianbei will rise up and destroy their sect in 6 months. The bus driver was thinking about Yu Shen's words and realized he'd lost 300,000 because each student was paid 30,000. The guy asked the man if he could copy the recording, and the captain was a little surprised, asking him why he needed it. The guy said that during the exam the answers were unknown, so after thinking it was dangerous and then being saved, 12 people could get 360,000. The angry captain yelled at the kid that it was unfair to his classmates and promised to report him to the Magu. The guys behind him finally decided to take the opportunity to butter up the boss by praising his harshness. Yu Shen turned around and walked toward the exit, tossing off a comment about giving the captain half. The man laughed, immediately promising to take care of everything, while the overseers, who had only supported his harshness, stood silently with twisted faces. Kaozai and Duzu struggled against the wild dog, but their strength was slowly running out. In the tense moment, Kaozai suddenly remembered Yu Shen, saying that if the guy had been there then he'd have called him dad. Out of nowhere, slow steps started approaching from behind them, getting closer every second. Both turned around to see who it was and were totally shocked by what they saw. Standing in front was Yu Shen with white-hot eyes, and right in front of him snarled the hellhound. Zhao Zai quietly called the guy dad, not believing his wish came true so fast. The guy looked at his friend in shock and casually said it didn't seem like his style to use such words, but the friend didn't even notice and asked Shen where he'd been. He scratched his head, yawned, and said he was in the bathroom, pretending like nothing happened. CZI immediately called him out on the lie, saying the noise was too loud to miss, and the guy agreed, apologized because he wasn't the best at lying. Du Xiu and Yu Shen just stood there in silence, not knowing what to say or do, so they just stared at Shen. The guy stood calmly by the hellhound, not even flinching, while the dog didn't react to him either. Du and Zhao were stunned by the twist, since the guy walked past the rabid dog without even looking at it, just like the hound did. Du Sui scowled and told Zhao that he thought they'd be safer together. After those words, Yu Shen grabbed the fence and started thinking about how to save the others. He looked up at his new comrades and asked if he could really hurt them bad. The poor guys stood there not knowing what to say, trying to wrap their heads around what the kid was about to do. In the blink of an eye, Zhao Zai was on all fours, right hand gripping his heart and screaming in pain. Yu Shen gave Du Zhu a knowing look, and after he got what he meant, he sighed heavily and accepted the situation. A few seconds later, the man hit the cold floor, clutching his lower back and moaning in pain, drawing attention from the students around him. Watching the awesome scene unfold, Yu Shen looked into the camera lens that was recording everything. Then he stepped up to the hound and started shouting, solemnly recalling the fierce demon that terrorized his comrades and telling them how, as young members of Moje, they once vowed to protect people at any cost. Since the hellhound didn't really get the guy, her big words meant nothing, so the demon snarled and tried to attack him again. The captain watched the touching scene on the computer screen, thinking that if he saw it, he'd get upset and send the money right away. The observers stood behind him, watching the movie on the screen, while the driver thought about whether it was really worth giving the young guy so much room to maneuver. One of the guards suddenly took a closer look at the picture on the screen, and his expression instantly turned incredibly puzzled. He grabbed the captain by the shoulder, pointed his finger at the computer, and ordered him to look. On the other side, it was clearly visible how Yu Shen fought the demon, shouting that protecting his comrades was his sacred duty and that the human torch would never go out again. The bus driver was blown away by how amazing the guy was at putting on a show for the crowd. The guy kept up the act, covering for Zhao and saying his friends would get it if he hadn't showed up in time. The captain got so angry he almost believed the kid's act and would have stripped him of his rank. The camera above suddenly started moving, and Yu Shen realized it was time to wrap it up. A terrifying demon in the form of a hellish hound lay motionless in the middle of a huge pavilion, with scared students standing 10 meters away. Zhao Zai stared at the dog and tried to wrap his head around the fact that this was really the end of that nightmare they just went through. Du Zhu's mind was racing with thoughts about how even though they were all students, there was a huge gap between them, showing just how helpless they were. The door to the compound burst open, and a human figure appeared shouting that he had all the gods of the world with him. Standing in the middle of the pavilion was a weird guy in torn clothes, and above his head hovered a bowl that glowed around him as he claimed to have given new souls to the gods. Zhao Zai was the first to realize it was a level 1 awakened being, which didn't exactly cheer him up. The students, still scared from realizing the guy was a heretic, were stunned because they didn't know where he came from. Out of nowhere, the bowl above the weirdo's head blazed with an even brighter light, making some people squint their eyes shut. Ko returned to Du Zuyu and said the heretics killed without mercy, so they hoped it wasn't part of the exam. But Zai knew the awakened first level one was way stronger than the Hellhound, so their only hope was. Everyone turned to Yu Shen at the same time, staring at him with eyes that clearly had something to say. The circus didn't make the boy wait long, and in an instant, the students grabbed different parts of their bodies and fell down, complaining about the terrible pain after the battle. Ko Zai, thinking about how this was one of his smartest concessions, smiled pretty. Yu Shen, on the other hand, didn't panic at all, and as usual, told the stranger that killing people was against the law. But the weirdo, as if he didn't even notice those words, so he immediately charged at the boy with a scream. The guy just barely dodged his attack, and the man smashed his magical bowl on the concrete floor. He busted a hole in her, his eyes flared red with flames, and the awakened one said those skills would definitely impress the gods. After those words, the man looked up and saw no one in front of him. The kid just vanished into thin air. Yu Shen, already aiming his own crossbow at the jerk, asked again why killing was forbidden. The man, without thinking, decided to kill all the other present students first, making them all scream and squeal. The stranger looked possessed, constantly repeating that the gods were with him and their glow was eternal. But the show was about to end real quick, because Yu Shen showed up behind him out of nowhere with a tiny blade in hand. In the next second, the guy slashed the man's back with the blade, and he didn't even have time to react because the strike was totally unexpected. The guy jumped to the side and slashed again, this time cutting the guy's hand, making him almost drop the magic bowl. The awakened guy didn't get it at first, but after a while he started screaming in pain, seeing a bunch of blood pouring out of his hand. He froze in place and screamed, while the young guy nimbly jumped to the other side. He had nothing but hatred and a thirst for justice in his eyes, because no one had the right to kill innocent people outside the criminal city. After catching his breath, the first guy regrouped and charged at the guy, swinging his weird bowl at him. The last thing he managed to do before his inevitable fall, since the guy stepped back, was shout threats of murder at him. Dozens of times after that, the man tried to reach Yu Shen and somehow punish him, But it all came to nothing because the guy was way too quick. The captain kept a strict watch on all this and knew that the heresy had somehow found a way to return. He grabbed the mic and screamed at Lo Yun to take care of the heretic who popped up during the exam, because it could end really badly. Liu Xingfen yelled at Yu Shen that killing heretics was allowed in the human world, finally giving the wig the green light. The teacher watched the kid from the sidelines and was amazed by his skills, which not every adult could pull off. He shouted again that the law didn't ban killing heretics. In fact, it paid 100,000 for it. Finally figuring out the final plan, the guy charged toward the first one and took control of the situation. He grabbed the guy's hand so tight he couldn't move it, and the only thing left for him was to comply. The guy lost his balance and went flying down to the ground, bending under the guy's counterattack. His confidence turned to fear and panic when he felt the next blade touch his neck and slice it right in half. The guy slumped to the concrete floor, and the bright red pool of blood forming under his head was the last thing he saw. The students watching all just stared in shock that Yu Shen just killed him. Everyone immediately started whispering among themselves about how the guy was incredibly brutal, while he stood emotionless over the man's body, staring straight at him. Out of nowhere, he went back to his teacher and asked why he'd never seen the law the teacher had told him about. The teacher snapped that only someone who had awakened could truly understand the rules. To Suyi, who was stunned at the dead body, someone suddenly shouted that Yu Shen just took someone's life. The teacher returned and scolded the young man for blaming Yu Shen, since everyone present in the pavilion had agreed to kill back then. Lu Xinfeng yells that if it wasn't for Yu Shen, everyone present would have been dead by now. He orders the kids to look at the dead body, the wounds, the eyes, and face the fear that'll help them. Zhao Zai was the first to speak up, saying he wasn't scared at all because his dad was the head of security. The rest of the kids all backed him up, shouting they weren't scared either, just like Zhao. After making a few conclusions from everything that happened, the teacher said some kids should go back to normal life, so they'd be heading back to school tomorrow. He rushed back to Yu Shen and quickly ditched the guy to get him to follow. They walked around the factory under a black starry sky when the teacher asked if the guy had killing experience, and he agreed. The teacher studied his student carefully and asked when it first happened, but the guy couldn't remember the exact date, so he said around 5 or 6. Deep down, Lu Xinfen felt bad for the kid because he'd started down this dirty path at such a young age. Out of nowhere, the guy said killing wasn't even illegal in the criminal city. The teacher slumped, puffing on a cigarette, and admitted that Shen was the best he'd ever seen, his talents almost unstoppable. He lit the cigarette, not wanting to talk about Shen's past, but believed in the guy's good heart. The mentor told the guy never to point a weapon at people, but Shen's reply was pretty vague, even though he agreed. Realizing this, the mentor turned to face him, eyes wide and staring straight into Shen's. He said Shen should get a reward from Moji for being good, and the teacher grinned, saying he'd definitely give him money if Moji refused to pay. The guy grabs a dagger and heads toward the demon, then explains to his teacher he's gonna slice the demon up and sell the meat. His teacher tells him the demon that just turned into a monster is worth nothing, but the meat inside is super bitter. The guy yells and, like always, walks toward the warehouse with his hands in his pockets. Lo Tian approaches Lu Xinfen and warns him he's only allowing a small misunderstanding. The teacher gives him a skeptical look and sarcastically asks if he really trusts him. Lo Tian smiled and told the guy not to wait for the reward for the young man's assessment because he'd get angry, especially if he found out the teacher took the reward. After checking his back and making sure no one was following, the guy went back and headed to the room he knew. Before opening the door and stepping in, he looked around one last time and, confirming everything was clear, walked into the room. Inside, the bus driver greeted him with a huge smile, introduced himself as Wang Wangxuan, and was all about how they together sorted out the situation. The man joked that they were getting double the reward for teamwork, but those words just made Yu Shen angry, and he sternly said that kind of cooperation didn't count. Captain's smile started to fade as he realized the guy had a rule about honesty. Wan Wen then jumped in with enthusiasm, claiming he was the guy's eternal guardian and always there to help if anyone blocked his path to riches. The guy coolly warned that he'd report the man to Mog right away if he even thought about killing. The man chuckled and said his resolve had vanished, while Yu Shen stood there thinking about who he should team up with next. The captain finally walked away, and the guy immediately thought about the third rule of the criminal city's code, which said never get close to idiots. Finally, after that brutal and long night, the long-awaited warm morning finally arrived. The body of the awakened one still lay in the pavilion, with Du Sui and Zhao Zai sitting around him. The students were watching the scene when suddenly the pavilion's door burst open, and the school bus driver rushed in. He told the kids they were heading home, which made them super happy. Just an hour later, the kids were already on the bus, sitting there with sad looks and staring out the window. Zhao Zai suddenly kicked Yu Shen in the ribs, turning to the guy and addressing him directly. He turned to his friend and told him he'd help with his problem as soon as he got home, but Shen didn't immediately get what he was talking about. Out of nowhere, the guy remembered asking his buddy to extend his dad's deadline on the way to the exam. Shen agreed, and Zhao Zai's joy was through the roof, because the guy really did appreciate the favor and even thanked him. Suddenly, someone grabbed Yu Shen's right shoulder and yanked him back a little. Du Zu's face pops up and he says he wanted to be like Shen, so he asked him to teach him how to kill. The guy's down, but he says the kid had a good heart and didn't get why he wanted to kill people since it's illegal. Du smiles and says his mouth isn't great, but he meant he wanted to get stronger. Seriously, the guy goes back and tells him he should get a tattoo and then he'd be way stronger. Finally, after a few hours of riding, the bus finally arrives in Mobi and students start getting off happy, just like the driver trying to catch up with Yu Shen. He clapped his hands and laughed, saying they really did get some rest, but the guy didn't react to the friendly comment at all. He got a little annoyed and went back to his husband, saying he just got off the bus, and the guy, getting the hint, calmed down and decided not to push him. The guy confidently opened the principal's office door and loudly announced he completed the mission. The principal said he heard about his success, but the evaluation results hadn't come in yet, and according to the agreement rules, his conditions should have been met after the final decision. The guy went back to the driver and asked him where the guy might be, and the captain loudly said he was first. Yu Shen confronted the director again and flat out told him he was the first one there. The man stared at the kid, confused about how he could ask a passerby such a question. But he awkwardly smiled and asked who the guy was who came with the kid. Yu Shen decided to take advantage of the situation and claimed the driver was from the province, and handled everything based on that qualification. The director immediately started apologizing to the driver, shaking his hand and showering him with compliments about such a young and promising provincial worker. But after that, like always, the man started complaining about how their little town lived in unimaginable poverty, no money or resources, and all they had left was to watch the young talents. The director whispered an order to the secretary to bring tea, then smiled and asked which department such a highly respected official came from. The driver took the teacup in his hands, got a little flustered, and said he was from the reserves. The director muttered the last word of his statement again in his head, because he thought he hadn't heard it right. But realizing he hadn't messed up, the man immediately took the teacup from Wan Wenyi and brought it back, leaving the captain standing behind feeling out of place. He came back to his desk pretty annoyed and sarcastically asked why he didn't say earlier that he was on standby. But Yu Shen wasn't about to answer that question, so he just held out his hand and asked where his promised fate was. The director reluctantly tossed a few bright emerald-colored pebbles onto his palm with a twisted look on his face. The boy grinned at them and clenched his fist proudly, happy with his work. They didn't waste much time in the director's office, so they left and headed down the long corridor. The guy's phone buzzed in his pocket, so he had to pull it out and answer it. Zhao Zai's cheerful voice came through, calling Shen's dad an incredibly cool guy. He told how he found Shen's dad in jail by tracking him down to one cop who thought he was on his hands. But Zhao added he'd successfully reclassified the crime under his guidance to a harsher charge, so Shen's dad's gonna be stuck in there for a while. Shen was happy about the great news and praised his friend because he actually did a solid job. Meanwhile, Shen and the captain finally made it to the secret ministry and walked confidently toward the main counter. Wan Wen was awestruck by the ministry's walls, taking in the intricate patterns that really blew his mind. Sitting at the main reception desk was a cute girl who smiled warmly at customers and tried to help them out. Suddenly, the lady noticed the two weirdos standing right in the middle of the main hall, and something about them set her off. Finally, the girl got it why the adult man's face looked so familiar, since she couldn't figure out how he ended up there. She dialed the phone fast and told her husband on the other end that the ministry had another sick case of Wan. The worker at the neighboring counter heard that and screamed about the emergency, making all the counters shut down for a temporary break. The visitors stood confused, not getting what just happened because just a minute ago all the counters were working fine. Yu Shen watched the captain and figured talking too much wasn't trustworthy, since that was the first rule of the criminal city. Suddenly, a worried girl rushed up to the counter and begged for help, because her captain went on a dangerous mission and ended up in the hospital. The girl at the counter seriously told the other girl not to panic and to explain the situation again, but this time more calmly. The poor girl, still crying, started talking about the reward given to those who fought against heresy, and if her captain died, they'd all die without him. The worker placed a big book on the counter and told the girl she needed to check the company's policy. She quickly started flipping through a pile of pages that seemed like no one had opened in a really long time. Finally, she pointed at one of the pages and said the reward really existed, but the fighter had to record a video proof. The girl dropped a tiny item on the counter that looked a lot like a flash drive and handed it to the employee. The stranger tried to force a small smile, and the employee took the flash drive and thanked her. She plugged it into the monitor, typed quickly on the keyboard, and finally the video showed up on screen. The video clearly showed a stranger handing over a guide to 3 guys from a gang who were barely standing after the fight. The girl started crying again and begged the woman to help with the mission, but the employee didn't have the authority, even though she really wanted to. Suddenly, she had a new idea and jumped up saying she was gonna go find the boss who could help the poor guy. Yu Shen and the bus driver kept watching the whole thing, and the driver didn't like the woman running after the boss at all. Out of nowhere, a thought hit him, and without thinking twice, he decided to take the risk because money was everything to him. He ran to the counter shouting for help, telling the exact same story about the poor girl. Telling the worker to give him a recommendation letter, he looked at Yu Shen behind him with hope that the guy would help him out. The guy's face went from deadpan and indifferent to visibly shaken, and even a little scared. A huge figure suddenly appeared behind the captain, its eyes blazing with fury. Shen realized it was the security chief of Bai Chunchen, the same guy Wen had mentioned before, and the captain, sensing the heavy breath behind him, suddenly lost all his courage and resolve. The man knew his life was hanging by a thread, so he tried to come up with something to save himself. When Wen pretended not to notice the commander behind him, started praising and idolizing his husband, hoping the guy would show mercy after lying about his death. Finally, the woman behind the counter lost her patience with the guy's nonsense and yelled at him, kicking him out. Out of nowhere, the captain finally heard the commander's sarcastic question about how dare he say the guy was dead. Wan Wen rushed back and actually saw Chen Yimou, his former commander who had retired. Compared to the giant man, Wan Wen looked like a helpless, useless speck. Even though he wanted to live, the bus driver grabbed the giant's hand and casually told him he'd explain everything right then. Captain whispers something to the commander, who gets really surprised and asks if the guy Van was talking about was really that good. The man shakes his head and confirms his words, then adds that he was actually a real rich guy. Chen Mo glares at Yu Shen and gives him a calculating look that seems a little suspicious. The man starts walking toward the guy, then stops and shakes his hand, introduces himself. But the guy wasn't about to shake his hand, so the commander decides to put his hand on the guy's shoulder and smiles, telling him to report anyone who disrespected him in Ban Chun Chen right away. Yu Shen dodged his hand and coldly said he didn't like fights at all, unlike money. Chen Yimou laughed and said he'd swear on his head that the guy would get his money. With a light smile, the man loudly declared it was his turn now and walked toward one of the counters where a girl with a flash drive stood. Finally, a worker showed up with the boss, confidently walking toward the counter where the poor young lady was. Meanwhile, the security commander kept telling the story of Wang Wen trying to get some money, while the boss and worker stood there staring at him, confused. The boss knew the big guy was a war hero, but every day all he did was sit around doing nothing. He told Chen to wait while he sorted things out with the girl he'd been told about. The guy was super nervous because his office had such a mix of talented young and old workers. He snapped at the girl and the commander, told the employee to blacklist them since they were scammers. Turning around and heading to his office, he said the commander couldn't do any of his tasks, and the commander started loudly arguing behind him. Chen Yimou grabs Yu Shen, pulls him close, and dares the boss to admit he knows who this guy is. The boss returns and skeptically questions the commander about the guy, while Yu Shen can't figure out how the boss could deny the officer's rank and the commander's repeated awakenings. Chen Yimou, not hesitating, explains that Shen was his good friend who bled and killed demons for humanity. The boss, hearing those words, turns around and smirks, remembering a few things. He mocks the commander, saying if he gave money to people like them every day, he'd be bankrupt in no time. Chen Yimou finally snapped and yelled at the guy for messing with him. The guys charged at each other but got blocked by a huge table. Yu Shen blushed and cleared his throat, politely asking if he could add a few words. The guy started talking about a Moj law that fighters in the city got a 6-month sentence and a 100,000 fine. Chen Yimou stared at the kid in shock and said he never signed those orders. Yu Shen kept pushing his case, saying he'd filed a formal request to take on the mission, and the law on rights protection meant they couldn't just say no. Chen was confused by Yu Shen's weird behavior, so he asked Wang Wen if the guy was even thinking straight. The guy told his boss to check the accreditation video, but the boss got mad and refused to watch it or give him a task. But the worker decided to play it safe and plugged in the flash drive Shen gave her. She watched the video carefully and pointed out the obvious signs of editing. The guy agreed with her and asked to call in a specialist to analyze the situation since the odds were stacked against them, and the students would lose without his help. Seeing what was on the video, the boss flatly ordered the girl to let the guy through and give him the full reward according to standard procedure. The girl immediately followed her boss's orders and got back to her usual routine. She tapped a few keys on her computer and within seconds smiled at the guy, telling him the money would hit his account in the next few days. The guy thanked the girl, turned around, and coldly asked the boss why he had changed his mind so suddenly. The guy sternly asked the guy if he planned to work in the secret ministry, but Yu Shen didn't have those plans right now. He handed the kid a business card and said he was Minister Mo's assistant, and if the guy decided to join the secret ministry, his career wouldn't end there. Seeing that, Chen Yimou got really upset and called the boss, threatening him with retaliation, since it was unheard of for a reserve commander to be denied because of a kid. The man stared after the boss and didn't get why he did that, but he didn't dwell on it for long. Furious, Chen stood up and immediately slammed the door on Yu Shen, saying he'd make sure to give him a big payout next time. Commander grabbed Van Venya by the shoulder and dragged him along, telling him they had no time to waste, while the man didn't get why they'd just left the money behind. Officer snapped his teeth and barked at the captain, asking how he still had the guts to want the money after everything. After all that chaos, Yu Shen finally got to go back to school. As soon as he stepped into the courtyard, Zhao Zai spotted him, rushing over with a mix of joy and nervousness. The guy started telling him how the school's whole leadership had changed while he was gone because they won the accreditation. But the other two schools didn't agree with that. Zhao smiled at the guy and said things are gonna get back on track with him around, and they'll take down everything together. Yu Shen looked at him, then asked right away if the guy was ready for this. Zhao blushed and changed the subject by saying his teacher was looking for Shen, who was at the breakfast cafe nearby, surprising the guy a bit. Yu Shen went straight to the breakfast cafe where the teacher was known to hang out. He approached the teacher and asked why he was looking for Shen, and the teacher just pointed toward the waiter serving dishes. Yu Shen knew that guy because all the classmates called him the lame Van. Lu Xingfeng took a glass of water to his lips and asked the guy what he thought of that waiter. Shen went back to him and said he didn't have any thoughts because he didn't know the waiter that well. Teacher Lu started telling how the lame Van used to be a reserve officer and trained there for 2 years, but because some data was missing, he got sent to the East Guarantee. On the third day of being there, the poor guy got attacked by some evil spirit and broke his leg, so the guy had no choice but to go back home. The mentor locked eyes with the guy and told him he wanted to talk about how things weren't so sweet for people right now. Lu Xinfeng asked the guy if he'd save the lame Wan if he saw him in danger, but Yu Shen didn't know the answer. The guy explained he'd seen the saved guy point a knife at his savior and watched as one loaf of bread cost 3 lives. The teacher stood up and said he probably shouldn't have made the guy do it since the world had never been on his side. He walked up to Shen, put a hand on his shoulder, and asked himself why he even made the guy fight for the world. The teacher suddenly noticed something that made him nervously swallow his saliva and pull his hand away from the guy's shoulder. The guy was holding a small blade in one hand, the same one he'd used to slice up the rabid awakened creature earlier. The man took a step to the right and suggested they talk about something else. He asked Yu Shen if he had friends, and the guy told him about the girl who was stuck in the criminal city, though she was supposed to be out in 307 days. The teacher lit a cigarette and asked the guy what he'd do if his girlfriend tried to get caught. The guy coldly looked at his mentor and told him he'd kill anyone who dared to think that way. But Lu Zhenfeng didn't back down and asked if it was the whole world. But the guy's mind stayed the same because he was ready to kill the whole world. He looked at the crippled Wan and added that he was the same, except he was protecting this world. Yu Shen didn't know that, so he stared at the poor guy serving desserts to cafe guests, looking genuinely sad. Lu Zhenfeng tossed his cigarette and told the guy to follow him because the teacher wanted to show him something. After 15 minutes of walking, they ended up at a veterans camp where dozens of broken souls were watching the guests. Out of nowhere, a man approached them, asked the instructor who he'd brought this time, and Lu calmly introduced his student. The man walked up to the guy, checked him out carefully, scratched his beard, and added that the kid looked decent. But Yu Shen noticed a weird magazine sticking out of the stranger's jacket. In that same second, Shen leaned in and reminded the man of Mog's criminal code, which stated that selling such magazines publicly could get him 15 days in jail or a 2,000 yuan fine. The stranger stared at the kid in disbelief, and the kid showed him 3 fingers, adding that exactly that amount would be enough. The guy grabbed Yu Shen by the shoulder and led him in the opposite direction from the teacher, saying he just wanted to talk to the kid about something. He got angry and said 30,000 would have cost him his life, but the guy replied he meant 300. The angry camp worker scolded the guy, saying he only bought a few magazines to make a little money. Yu Shen wasn't backing down, so he cleared his throat and added that those magazines sold for 1 yuan in the north of Mobu at Brown's music store. He said the magazines there sold for 1 yuan each, so the guy should still have 800 left. The guy shouted that 200 was the max he could offer. Otherwise, Shen would just walk out and embarrass him in front of the teacher. But the guy shrugged and said if he reported his man to the ministry, he'd get 5,000, then started dialing the number. The stranger snatched the phone out of his hand and said it was his earnings for the funeral, since his conscience was still there somehow. But since the guy didn't hang up, someone's voice came through the phone asking for his name. Chen Yushu immediately called it a big mistake and panicked, slamming the phone down. He gave the guy 300 and said he wouldn't even haggle, since the guy didn't take money seriously at all. The man started grumbling that he was a hero who'd been calming and guarding demons for 30 years, spilling blood along the way. Lu Senfeng smiled as he watched his old friend and the guy, happy that Chan Yushu had really taken to the guy. Finally, they started heading back to the teacher, and Chan Yushu kept raving about the guy, saying he had great upbringing. The teacher blushed cutely and thanked for the kind words, adding he'd keep trying hard. Yu Shen thought for a sec, and told the guy he could tweak his business model by swapping those illegal discs for regular ones, which would cut down on the stress. Right then, Zhang Yushu realized the guy actually had a decent grasp on business stuff. He asked if Yu Shen had woken up yet, and Yu Shen replied that the assessment was supposed to be this week. The man grinned and asked the guy how many patterns he had, but the guy just ignored him. He laughed and said that kind of caution wasn't needed since he should learn to trust people around him. The teacher brought the guy to the veterans to show him the graves, so in just a few minutes they were standing in front of the wife's, sons, and parents' graves of old Jae-han. The mentor explained that he left the last empty grave for himself, because the man lived so long alone that he'd seen 2 shifts of the Ministry of Impure changeover. He said people could live different lives, but no matter what, the human race always needed those who could protect it. Liu Sinfeng gently placed a hand on the young guy's head and said he hoped to see the guy as a protector. Remembering what happened last time, the man carefully looked at the boy's hands, but this time he didn't see any weapons. The mentor told Yu Shen that there was a huge world outside the criminal city that he just had to see. But then they heard Zhang's angry shout behind them, ordering them to leave his family tomb because it wasn't a zoo. Lu Senfeng got a little flustered, realizing the guy was right, while Shen stayed as cool as ever. A mysterious man in a black cloak sat at a small table and quietly told the divine servant on the phone that the plan needed to speed up. He explained that the last operation was too big because even the Ministry of Impure Exile had to join the cleansing, which caused massive losses. The guy snapped, yelling that starting the plan during the inspection was a no-go because Jiangbei was the most heavily guarded spot. Yu Shen stood in the middle of the school principal's massive office, ready to say something important. But a weird scroll popped into his head, making him think about his magic stick that doubled his strength and speed and boosted his combat power tenfold. The principal gave him a fake smile and asked if he had guarantees his results would make it to the top 10. But the guy had no clue. In the criminal city's rules, you never trusted anything unless you had all the info, because the mission could still fail. The director said the limit used to be a score of 100, and for every time a guy moved up the list, he was gonna give him something. He paused for a second, then slammed his fist on the table and added he'd give the guy 100 each time. And if he made it to first place, he'd get 10,000. After hearing those terms, Yu Shen turned around and headed for the door, saying goodbye to the principal. The principal immediately blocked the guy's exit and told him if their school made it to 3rd place in the regional ranking, they'd get a big chunk of cash to split 70-30 between them. The guy looked up at the principal and praised his plan, but ended up asking if the man wanted to make more money. He came back, walked back to the director's desk, and started explaining a plan involving school uniforms that needed 3 students to get involved. The guy told the principal to send his agreement to the administration, and then put up an ad on the school uniform. He handed him a business book and said the students would become walking ads because they'd take good spots and give interviews exactly in this school uniform. Finally, the guy said that's how they'd achieve fame, and the kids would be more than happy to spend money on the school uniform. Hearing such a great plan, the principal was excited and said the guy could trust him because the head of the education department in Mobi was his old friend. Yu Shen suddenly asked the guy if he was a reserve officer, catching him off guard and making him surprised he was one. The guy still stared at him, said nothing, and figured the man wasn't trustworthy. He asked how the director planned to split the money, and the guy grinned, saying Shen would get 60%, which he thought was pretty generous. The boy turned his head and stared blankly out the window, showing his own frustration. The man screamed he'd give the kids 70%, and that was the limit, since the school's reputation and his connections were worth money. Yu Shen gave the director a nod and agreed to the deal. The director ran to the table, saying he'd stamp the contract to make the agreement official. The guy pulled out his phone and said he'd recorded the whole conversation on a voice recorder, so the contract wasn't needed. He walked out of the office without hesitation, slamming the door behind him and leaving the director staring after him in confusion. The man was boiling inside because all he wanted was money, but now he had to worry about whether the kid would report him to the ministry. A week later, Yu Shen stood in the exact same spot, carefully inspecting the jacket with ads on its back. Zhao Zai stood in the gym where the exam was about to start, begging Yu Shen not to beat him up, but Yu Shen just stood silently across from him. The guy's eyes were watery, blood was dripping from his nose, and his face was covered in bruises, yet he begged Shen to at least make it slower. Before Zhao could finish his plea, Yu Shen swung his fist and accidentally prepared to hit him. The poor guy braced for the worst, clenching his teeth and closing his eyes tight. He heard a loud crash and the echo in his body as the guy aimed at the battle fruit Zhao was tightly gripping. The guy screamed and both the fruit and him flew to the ground, losing balance. He didn't let go of the fruit and while spilling out, whispered that even though his friend was kind, the punch was incredibly strong. Standing by Su, he thought about boosting his combat skills since that's why he transferred to the new school. But seeing how Shen grabbed his friend's leg and started flipping him sideways while he screamed in pain, Dusu's thoughts shifted a bit. The guy's patience ran out and he jumped into the fight just for kicks. A few minutes later, Du Shai lay on the floor next to poor Zhao in the exact same state. Yu Shen stepped out into the hallway, stared at the floor, and a teacher slowly approached him. Seeing the guy flying through the sky, Lu Xinfeng walked up and asked what he was thinking. The boy lifted his eyes and asked why he had to fight like on an exam, since he didn't want to and wasn't planning to. The mentor offered him the choice to shoot wide or dull the blades of his knives. But the guy didn't like the idea because he wasn't planning on messing with his weapons anyway. Shen looked down again and asked Lu Xingfen why killing people was banned outside the criminal city. Hearing his student ask that question, the mentor laughed and put a hand on his shoulder. Then he gently ran his hand through his hair and asked if the guy remembered the veteran from the cafe. The mentor said he was heading to the veterans camp tomorrow since his only son also joined the reserves. He said that lately, Mogi had been pushing him pretty hard because the teacher didn't have any kids of his own, so he also needed to go to the veterans camp. But after a short pause, he added that since Shen was his student, it was considered a kid, and the teacher wanted to use that privilege to skip the camp and stay with him. The guy agreed because the teacher had really become pretty close to him, even though he used to not really like him much. The instructor looked at his student with a gentle gaze, and for a moment, tears flickered in his eyes before he quickly pushed them away. They walked through the city toward Mobi's gates, and after a few dozen minutes of walking, they finally reached their destination. Lu Xingfeng told the guy to think twice, because he had almost no issues with his character. Shen approached the table where a man with a badge on his neck was writing down names, ages, ID numbers, and parent names for everyone wanting to join. The guy gave his name and age. Then the man asked if the guy's dad was the one standing next to Lu Xingfeng, and he said his dad didn't show up. The teacher took charge of the situation and confidently asked the man to write down his guardian's name since he was the guy's teacher. Then a loud explosion rocked the area several blocks away from the city gates. People around freaked out and started panicking, thinking the explosion happened near the school. The man with the badge shouted that the heretics were back, and that Moke had already sent people to deal with them, telling everyone to calm down. Lu Xinfeng called out to Shen, called him the first in the province, and said he was waiting for him. The teacher opened the portal, went through first, and then Yu Shen followed, waving goodbye to the man with the badge. Less than a minute later, people who just heard about the heretics started screaming and running in all directions. Out of nowhere, a guy with a badge shows up and tells Lu Xingfen the city's too dangerous, so they can't go there. The teacher snaps back, saying he's a reserve officer who's guarded the Demon's Rest for 2 years, so protecting people is his calling. Suddenly, a bunch of guys who used to serve in the Demon's Rest gather around him, all ready to fight for humanity. They all band together into one big squad, shout that protecting people is their main mission, and charge off to help. The badge guy yells after them that the city's a tough call, so he's staying behind to hope they win. He's stuck thinking about how humans used to stand their ground against demons before. But this time things are different because humanity's weakened and the outcome's way too unpredictable. A bunch of weird strangers in cloaks crashed into the school, clearly heretics. Van Wen, standing in the middle of the pile of kids ready to fight, confirmed the heretics really decided to attack the school. One of the students, who looked older than the rest, snapped that they needed to act fast. Another, holding a red Chupa Chups, suggested fighting to the death since it'd be faster. The heretics finally got close to the school and started shouting their prayers to the Lord, while Van Wen was still pulling out his big axe from behind his back. The captain barked orders that since Moj wasn't there, he was in charge and the army had 5 minutes to end the battle, with heads flying for anyone who disobeyed. After that loud declaration, he heard behind him grumbling that a guy who just joined the reserves shouldn't be giving such rude orders. The bus driver came back and saw the figure of Lu Xinfen arriving to help behind him. He slipped the bus driver while he wasn't looking and made him crash to the floor, then laughed and reminded him not to get distracted during a fight. The guy who came with him laughed and said he remembered Van Wen because he used to beat him every day in the army, and Van Wen would cry loudly in response. Lu Xinfeng barked orders to block the gates and keep new victims away since he brought people to protect the school. Before the moment could even pass, a terrifying battle broke out between the defenders and the heretics. Chung, who hadn't been able to fish in ages, was enjoying the sight of the float bobbing in the water as the waves gently rocked it. Then he heard heavy footsteps behind him and knew right away that his fun was over. Behind him, the head of the ministry's assistant, Moj, confidently stepped toward him. Frustrated, Jun turned back and demanded to know what happened because the man had scared him. The man explained that Lin Feng from the 4th generation had begged him to return from his seclusion. Zhang sighed in relief, thinking it was Maida returning, so he scolded the stranger and ordered him to leave because he wasn't going back. He went back to the fisherman and added that if he had returned with his current power level, he'd have just been blown away by the wind. The man begged him to come back again because the 3rd generation was barely holding the front line without Zhu, and the monastery couldn't stand against the corruption without him, but the fisherman kept refusing. A representative from the ministry pulled out a weird little box from his pocket. He opened it up and handed it to Zhu, asking him again to return because he believed the thing inside would convince him beyond a doubt. The fisherman smiled and asked if his body would really be become the same as before if he ate the pearl inside the box. The stranger said that an attack had hit Moby, and the city was in chaos, so without the man's help, everyone would end up watching people die. Jun turned his head in annoyance and scolded him for threatening to take the lives of innocent people. The poor guy was willing to accept any terms because he was just fighting for Moby and had nothing else to offer. Finally, after a pile of arguments, the fisherman stood up, took a breath, and grabbed the magical pearl in his hands. Suddenly, behind him, a question was asked if the man was really willing to become a human support again. And behind him, he saw 3 men in long black cloaks who happily congratulated the respected Jun. The minister's envoy turned angrily toward them and asked if they didn't have the other 2. The leader didn't notice and said if Zhang eats this medicine, demons will start a big battle for the purity seal in 3 days. But it didn't scare him and he just smirked, reaching for the magical pearl. A mysterious magical force suddenly surrounded the men, swirling around them all, especially the pearl in Zhang's hand. Without hesitating, the man threw the magical medicine into his mouth and swallowed it, taking that desperate step. Suddenly his body glowed with strange purple light, his eyes flared with blue fire, and a huge spear started to appear behind him. One of the heretics screamed in fear when he realized it was the 8th Bodhi, the highest spiritual enlightenment. Finally, completely transformed, Zhang loudly declared that the heretics had gone to great lengths to hide their spy in Manga. Suddenly, fear flared in one of their eyes as the man couldn't figure out what was going on. But the master confidently said the heretic had lived long enough to finally say goodbye. The magical spear behind him suddenly spun around, leaving a blue trail behind. He spins around in the air, slicing through all 3 heretics with a lightning-fast move that leaves them pierced straight through. One of the heretics who lasted the longest begged the master to answer one final question before dying, but the man refused, saying he didn't have time. Chung told the representative, who was standing nervously behind him, to call Chen Yimo and order him to get the nets. The man didn't get it the first time, so the master had to repeat it twice, but this time he got really annoyed. The messenger dialed the commander's number and told him that Master Chung had ordered the nets to be pulled out. The master grumbles about how the academy's now full of clueless guys after hearing the man's shaky voice. He orders the messenger to follow him right then because it's time to wrap up the whole thing. Veterans from the camp show up behind the messenger, looking sad as they ask if the master really won't be coming back. The man keeps walking, growling that if his old bones could still help humanity, it'd be worth it. Yu Shen calmly walks through the forest with a crossbow in hand, since that's where the exam was supposed to happen. Out of nowhere, he ran into 2 huge creatures that looked like demonic wolves. In his head, he figured the monster's high defense made it impossible to kill them with a regular crossbow bolt. But then his hands flickered with a purple glow and a few things appeared, leaving the guy confused and unsure if his awakening was real. In an instant, one of the monsters heard the strange magic sounds, and its eyes flared up with blue flames. The big demon immediately charged at the guy, snarling and slashing out with its massive claws. Yu Shen's magic weapon was still forming in his hand, as he flew toward the guy, glowing purple around a broken shard. The guy didn't wait for the magic to finish and pulled out a dagger, jamming it into the demon's tough body at the last second. Blood splattered on the ground right away, and the guy took pride in his solid attack. Sensing danger, a bunch of other demons started coming out of the woods, looking more like real wolves now. But that didn't faze the guy at all. He was already swinging between wolves, slicing their throats one after another. A few minutes later, the grassy field where Yu Shen shot the demons was completely covered in blood-soaked corpses of the evil spirits. But then he noticed a weird bird screeching loudly on the tree right above his head. In an instant, a whole bunch of those same birds flew over him, clearly with bad intentions. The creatures attacked the guy, trying to hit him, but his counterattack came fast and hard. The stranger on one of the tallest tree branches stared at the field, shocked that the animal spirits had all died in just 15 minutes. He checked the map in his hands and saw a big red mark right in the middle of the forest. The man was genuinely surprised someone had already made it so far, but he immediately thought it might be Yu Shen, the one everyone was talking about. He stared hard into the distance, wondering if after all these years, Zhongbei's misfortune had finally gone away. Yu Shen was flying through the trees at full speed, trying to get to the destination as fast as he could. He kept telling himself he had to hurry up and get out there to see things for himself. Out of nowhere, a huge tiger appeared in front of the guy, forcing him to stop. The guy glared at the creature, mentally cursing it and feeling a bit let down. In the next second, he unzipped his jacket and pulled out a bunch of big, really sharp needles, then hurled them at the creature. But the sticks just bounced off the tough skin under the tiger's soft fur, angering the demon. But Shen stayed calm and pulled out a really weird thread from somewhere, wrapped it around 2 fingers and glared at the demon. Out of nowhere, a stray arrow shot out from behind the guy and he barely dodged it. The arrow hit the tiger's neck and barely grazed it, but for a huge animal like that, it was basically nothing. Grabbing the weird thread with both hands, the guy jumped up, ready to pounce on the tiger that was already flying toward him. The guy wrapped the thread around the tiger's neck so fast the beast didn't even notice. Without giving the tiger a chance to react, Yu Shen landed on the ground, pulled both ends of the rope, and the thing finally crushed the tiger's neck. The helpless demon hit the ground, stuck his tongue out, and stayed lying there at the guy's feet. Shen was happy with his work, and glad it was over because he could finally go through the portal and join the others. The guy was serious about it, so he knew he'd face Master Lu alive or dead as soon as he came out. The instructor, who had been desperately competing against the heretics, suddenly saw a portal behind him with a male figure slowly emerging from it. It really surprised him that the guy managed to escape in just 20 minutes. The guy looks at his teacher and asks with a bit of curiosity how his placement turned out. The teacher proudly says he was first in the whole province, or at least in Mobi. Hearing that, the guy turns around and heads toward the city, which doesn't sit well with his mentor. Liu Sinfeng blocks his path and tells him the city's way too dangerous and he's injured, so he needs to take care of that first. Instantly, the guy aims his crossbow at the teacher. A ND Chinese letter threatens to shoot him if he tries to stop him again. But the teacher didn't back down and snapped that the boy would have to kill him if that's the case, since he wouldn't let him into the city. Yu Shen didn't immediately put away his weapon because he was convinced deep down that his teacher was either scared of death or this whole thing was fake, and he was just acting out. But the guy still put away his crossbow and said he'd take responsibility for his own life, then walked around his teacher and told him to back off or he'd really have to kill him. Meanwhile, the city was locked in a real battle between heretics and brave defenders of Mobi, who were desperately fighting off the evil forces. One of the most skilled fighters was that same student who looked way too young for her age, as she one by one put the idolaters to sleep forever. Sometimes a weird diamond-like object would pop up in her hands, super rare in those parts, but she used it to take down a bunch of heretics trying to chill her out. Other black-cloaked guys just stood there watching their buddies get beat up, too scared to jump in. Defenders cut their throats one by one and stabbed them with sharp swords, fighting for their own freedom. The cute girl who had been chomping on a chupa chupa the whole time calmly killed guys with smirks on their faces, totally chill about what people thought. The bus driver kept shouting loud slogans to cheer on the soldiers and told them to hold their ground. Out of nowhere, a huge golden spear appeared in his hands, and the guy charged at the group of heretics as fast as he could. That spear almost ended up being the last thing one of the blacksmiths saw, but he managed to dodge at the last second. In the same second, Van Venya grabbed a big axe and swung it at the guy again. But the guy was surprisingly quick, dodged his attack, and knocked the man down to the ground. The captain went flying to the ground, but seconds later a lady showed up with a big knife and did the same thing to the heretic. The girl stabbed him in the back with her knife and yelled threats, then he screamed in pain. The bus driver glared at the savior, embarrassed that he let the girl save him. New heretics kept showing up, making it look like there were tons of them that the defenders couldn't stop. Meanwhile, another group at the school was shouting loud threats at people. Lu Xingfeng and the principal stood at the school gate, knowing they couldn't stop the chaos at the door. The teacher grabbed his big sword ready for battle and shouted that they had to hold out until backup arrived. Seconds later, the black-cloaked guys were all flying around the man, trying to escape his cursed sword. Lu Xingfeng fought the dark forces without fear, defending his honor and protecting all of humanity. The poor students watched from the window, terrified out of their minds. The director yells at the kids, telling them they get to see what happens to anyone who attacks his people. A huge red sword pops up behind the man as the director says he once had to take a pledge of obedience to the unclean back in his day. The man grabs the director's hand and charges into the heretics, not holding back on any of them. They cut through the idolaters one by one with Lu Senfen, remembering their own youth and happy that their victory is finally in sight. Suddenly, the director hears some weird sounds that grab his attention and make him turn back. Out of nowhere, a weird guy with wings pops up and laughs at their talk about cleaning the world of evil. The school principal yells at them, calling their group ugly monsters who don't care about humans. The cook-looking weirdo says humans can only live in harmony with gods after light is poured onto the earth. The teacher snaps back, saying since the weirdo didn't bother protecting humans, it's time to start the battle. The guy stares at him with a glassy look and laughs, saying he actually likes the teacher's straightforwardness. Out of nowhere, he flared his crimson wings and dove straight at the warriors. He crashed into Lu Zhenfen and knocked the devilish grave sword from his hands, which was pretty symbolic. Looking at the weak teacher, the bird-like creature sneered that he really felt bad about it, since the sword would finally start killing civilians that day. But thankfully, the mentor managed to break free from the thief's grip and back away a few steps, turning the sword around. The beast laughed maniacally and declared that divine light was finally going to pour onto this world, since humans were nothing more than dirt on its surface. He flew into the air and loudly called out to the respected gods, asking them to grant humanity divine light. The teacher suddenly realized the guy was heading straight for the school and knew right away the Birdman's target was the students inside. He decided to take care of the problem himself, since protecting his students was every teacher's duty anywhere in the world. Lu Zhenfeng sprinted toward the school while keeping a close eye on the weirdo flying overhead in the same direction. Out of nowhere, he dove to the ground and, gathering all his strength, ordered the weirdo not to get near his students at all. The bird guy flew straight to the ground without even trying to react to the hit. The teacher's punch was so strong it literally blasted through the asphalt. But instead of dragging the cat by the tail, the man got up fast and said the teacher just made himself even angrier. Lu Xinfeng didn't wait long and called the guy a scumbag, then charged at him with his sword without giving him a chance to shout. This time the bird guy was a little more careful and just in time covered his face with his wings, stopping the teacher's attack. Lu Xinfeng stared at the scene in shock, not getting how it happened since no one had ever managed to stand up to his sword before. The chef locked eyes with the man and shouted that after his death he'd become a divine figure. Then feathers started flying out of his wings immediately. The teacher didn't expect that at all, so he just didn't know how to react to the feathers flying at him at crazy speeds. Even though they were small, the feathers left a bunch of deep cuts as they flew through Lu Xinfeng's body, making him bleed right away. The chef finally shed his wings, while the teacher collapsed weakly to the ground and was still struggling to stay on his feet. But the guy was really nuts, so he just laughed out loud, making the feathers spin around him. In the next second, he accelerated the tiny red feathers to light speed and fired that huge beam right at the man. But knowing how to fight back against such power this time, Lu Xinfeng waited a second and shouted the command to start. The guy swung his sword with all his might, heroically trying to block the red magic beam. In an instant, a purple magic beam appeared in front of his face, moving head-on toward the red one. The guy grits his teeth through the pain, piles everything into one shot, and blasts the guy with all his strength. A purple beam hits the fat guy right in the chest, knocking him off balance and sending him crashing to the ground. The guy's face shows confusion and panic, because he doesn't get how the teacher managed to pull this off. The cook with a huge sword stuck in his chest kneels before Lu Xinfeng. The teacher, clutching a bunch of wounds bleeding out, threatens to punish anyone who dares attack his people right then. After making sure he'd completely beaten the enemy, the guy collapsed to the ground, barely holding onto his own sword. He was just barely keeping his eyes open when he suddenly saw Yu Shen's slow approaching silhouette in front of him. At first, the teacher thought he was dreaming, since hallucinations were inevitable when dying. But it was really his student standing there, which made the mentor super happy. Yu Shen bowed to the teacher and told him he got first place in Mobi, but he still didn't know about the province, while the teacher said the kid had always been his favorite. Shen stared at his teacher with an unbelievably stunned look, realizing he was slowly dying. Lu Xinfeng tried to see death as a way to be freed from all earthly sins. He pulled out a small blue pin from his pocket and gave it to the guy, saying it was his little pride so the kid could feel like he belonged to the hero family. The guy took the gift in his hands, while the mentor said he'd been trying to protect him all along, even though he was from a criminal city. Lu Xinfeng reached out to grab the kid's head, but the boy leaned in on his own to meet his hand. His mentor told him never to let anyone change who he was because the guy was really special. Out of nowhere, the teacher saw a super bright white light that seemed to be calling him. Yu Shen looked at someone for the first time with such lost, terrified eyes and didn't know how to help his teacher. The teacher's sword suddenly blazed with bright white light, and a bunch of tiny butterflies flew up into the sky around him. A tear rolled down the young guy's cheek for the first time in his life, which finally made something inside him change. The guy stood up and screamed that everyone around him was gonna die because his eyes were blazing with rage, and his hands were full of determination. He grabbed his dagger and charged straight into the heretics, ready to kill every single one of them. He ran from one person to the next, slicing their throats and pouring out all his fury. He drove his knives deep into their necks, and all he saw in his eyes was unbearable pain. Other defenders rushed to stop him before his rage got out of control, but the guy didn't even notice. The bus driver was shouting, not getting what happened to Yu Shen, since no one had ever killed such a bunch of enemies or demons before. Chung, just arrived at school, was stunned by what was happening on the playground. The schoolyard was covered in a pile of dead black-skinned guys, and in another corner sat Lu Xinfeng motionless. His body was covered in blood-soaked wounds, and white butterflies were still flying around him. Finally realizing what happened, Chung slammed his spear into the ground and vowed to get revenge for his friend. He drove his spear into the asphalt so hard it shot out another purple magic stream. The man spun his weapon, knocking back all the blacklights around him while feeling the pain of his fallen friend in his heart. He spotted a huge silhouette with two red eyes behind the trees and said he didn't expect the old liar to show up. In an instant, a massive snake the size of a car burst from behind the trees into the school courtyard. Finally, Wan Wen realized the heretics' main plan was to destroy the main power first and then invite their king. Zhun sneered and said the six-star demon king decided to give him a gift for returning to his post. But the creature just snarled that what the man had once killed the demon king didn't mean he'd beaten the snake, and Zhao didn't agree with that and threatened the demon with brutal revenge. Without hesitating, the man lunged forward, aiming his spear straight at the snake's throat and charging in. But the creature managed to close its mouth in time, so the attack hit the snake's thick skin instead. His eyes filled with blood and flared with rage, which clearly wasn't going to end well. Zimei whipped his head around so fast he sent Zhuang flying, but the guy stayed calm and took control of the situation right away. He landed softly, stopping himself with his feet so much that smoke came out of them. Zimei dropped to the ground and glared at Zhuang straight in the eyes, ready to attack. The man grabbed his spear tight and confidently yelled that Zimei would soon join his previous emperor down under. With all his strength, the master charged at the demon as fast as he could. This time, the snake tried to dodge the attack to avoid getting hit, but it didn't help much since the guy had already figured out that move. Jun swung and threw a pointed spear right where the snake's skin was the thinnest. Jun glared at him and shouted that to keep the hero's spirit from being shamed, all that was needed was to wipe out every single one of them. The snake screeched in pain and collapsed onto the ground with all its massive strength.